going gets tough.
When the going gets tough.
DB results.
When the going gets tough.
DB results.
Well, there you go.
I'm Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture.
Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. We are broadcasting to you live on the unceded lands of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Here again, live from the Karum Swamp on Radio Karum. As always, you can join the conversation this evening and text us in the radio studio on 0493 213 831. We'd love to have you with us. My guests and conversation partners in the studio tonight are Charles and Leah Justin. Charles is the co-founder of SJB and Plus Architects, two major national and international architecture practices. He is a past president of the Architects Institute of Australia, Victoria chapter. He is also a past president of the Jewish Museum of Australia. He was recently chair of the Melbourne Art Foundation, who run the Melbourne Art Fair. He co-founded with his wife Leah the Justin Art House Museum in 2016. In 2022, he was awarded an AM in the Australian Honours. Leah Justin was a high school teacher before working as an architectural librarian. She later established and managed the adult education program at the Jewish Museum of Australia and was its director of community education for 20 years. She has also been involved in Jewish community affairs in a voluntary capacity for over 40 years. In 2016, she co-founded JAM with her husband, Charles. And I'm so lucky to have you both in the studio with me this evening. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
It's been a little while since I've had two guests at once. Viewers and listeners would know that we have a number of microphones here at Radio Karum, so we're very lucky to be able to have a group conversation tonight. There's a question I like to ask all my guests, and I'm a little excited because this is coming as a bit of a surprise to you, is what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
Of?
A building or place.
I don't know. You have to think how old I am. Memory is not one of my strong points. I suppose staying in a place when we first came to Australia, which was basically Jewish Care provided a place for us as immigrants, refugees, and it was essentially one or two rooms, and I actually remember that quite vividly. And as my parents worked within the space as well, my mum sewed skirts, and it was very much that immigrant experience that probably laid the foundation for my life here in Australia.
Amazing. What part of town was it in?
In St Kilda.
Do you remember how big the room was?
I would hazard a guess to sort of say it was about, I don't know, all the rooms together would have been about 30 square metres, something like that.
Wow, very, very efficient and really just about necessity. Where did your family come from, Charles?
My parents are Polish, but I was born in Belgium, so they were asylum seekers in Belgium after the war. And they met after the war, and that's where I was born. But because they were asylum seekers, they had no status, so they actually weren't allowed to work. Not dissimilar to asylum seekers in Australia. You know, they had all these restrictions. So they got a visa to come to Australia, which suited my mum really well because she wanted to get as far away from Europe as she possibly could, and I think that's why we ended up in Melbourne.
Yes, next stop Penguins.
Yeah.
What about you, Leah? What's your earliest memory of a building or place?
So what flashed into my mind was actually the cubby house at the back of our little cottage in St Kilda. Also, I didn't realise you were in St Kilda the first, Charles. It was a tiny little space. I have a twin brother and a sister, and it was where we used to go to just create, I don't know, imaginary worlds. It was quite extraordinary. And our little cottage was I mean, it felt huge to me, I think, as a kid, but it was a tiny little place. You had a formal parlour room where we had our excruciating piano lessons. Poor teacher. Then we had I had a room that I shared with my sister, which we had a little kerosene heater. Then our parents had a little room, and then there was this, probably as tiny a room where we would always have there was always people coming to sort of share meals, and then you went outside to a little toilet and a bathroom. That was very ensuite, but very out ensuite, which was where we bathed and we went to the toilet. And when I think of today, the way kids live, I mean, it's a light on go. But I love that house. I absolutely love that house because I suppose in the end, it's the memories that are sort of seated inside there is what made that space alive. And the street was so wonderful. I mean, it was classically Australian. You had at one end you had the pub, at the other end you had a brothel, and in the middle you had all these different neighbours. But we went and played on the street at night. You came home from school. Everyone went to the local school, and everything was on the street. And you only came in when it was dark. It was just a fantastic sense of community that was built there. And I think we were probably the only Jews in the street, but it wasn't about that. There were the Irish, and there were the Catholics. There was just this lovely sense of inclusion of everybody. It was a fantastic childhood space.
Classic early Australia.
Classic early Australia.
I'm already starting to see parallels between some of these early memories and your incredible museum, which we'll get to in detail later in the conversation, but these moments of very efficient use of space and then also parlour to receive people in and all this life happening. I just love these sparkles when moments come full circle, so we'll get there. We'll get there and return to it. Charles, how did you come to architecture and decide to become an architect?
Well, my parents had a host of friends, and one of them was a builder. And I think, like a lot of immigrants, had aspirations to be a professional, I think, and which were either denied the right to in Europe, or alternatively they're interrupted by the war. And I think he had a secret desire to be an architect. So he said, "Charles, you're going to become an architect." And for my bar mitzvah, he gave me his drafting desk that he created. So I grew up with a drafting desk in my bedroom, which I didn't know what to do with. And in many ways, it was suited to me because I think two of my strongest subjects were art and mathematics. And
you would have been a disastrous doctor.
Yeah, I did, that was always a challenge. I didn't have a very good bedside manner. So, and when I finished my high school, I had results which probably would have let me do anything. And all my friends were going into medicine, and I thought maybe I should become a doctor. And then I thought to myself, no, that'd be a disaster. So
for you and the patient.
yeah. So so I embarked on the world of architecture, and it was a wise choice because.
But your parents weren't keen on that. Your father thought it was a very precarious profession.
My mother was very supportive. My father was concerned because architecture, A, was unfamiliar to him, and B, he was very concerned about security. I think our parents' generation were very concerned about security.
Yes.
And he wanted me to be an accountant. He actually didn't want me to be a doctor. Must be the only Jewish father in the world who didn't want their son to be a doctor. And he wanted to be an accountant because his logic was that, an accountant becomes so dependent upon by their clients that you can't go wrong. You'll always have work. And luckily I had to practice accountancy, because to run a successful architectural practice you need to be on top of the finances. So but he got his wish.
You still needed it. How about you, Leah? When did your encounters with art and the creative world begin?
It's funny, when I was at high school, art was my absolute worst subject. Absolute worst subject.
Really?
I was a complete disaster. Everything that I painted in the art classes turned out to be, I didn't realise it at the time, early abstraction in studies in brown,
Brown monochromes.
Brown monochromes. Whether it was a seaside or whether it was a portrait, everything turned out. I hated going to art classes. I loved art history, although we didn't do art history in that same sort of way, but I actually always loved that. And when Charles and I met, I think we courted by going to the NGV had just opened some years before the new Roy Grounds extension, and I loved going to galleries, but I've never been art trained, and I don't have an artistic, frustrated artistic ambition. I'm not creative like that. I have other outlets, I suppose, but I think it probably was that the exposure to the NGV that probably sparked an awful lot of my interest.
Stunning.
in art. Yeah.
I have to ask, what was it like when it opened? What was Roy Grounds' masterpiece like when it was fresh?
Oh, it was amazing. It was sort of a building which was really unprecedented in Victoria, and I think the old version, well, I mean, it was basically based on a Renaissance palazzo, and with all the internal courtyards, and spatially it was fantastic, and
even the vitrines. I mean, they designed everything was designed. It wasn't left to chance.
And it was really world-class type building, and Victoria was also blessed with a sort of world-class collection as well because of Felton Bequest, and so it was a serious art museum, and so we really enjoyed it. Although nowadays I think we had to pay to get in.
Yeah.
Do you remember the reactions of the public at the time when it just opened?
Just the glass wall was so exciting.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Which had allusions to the fish and chip shop of the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
But to this day, it still has that same sense of
Truly a timeless building.
Yeah, absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, I think you need to have a lot of regard for the government to actually commit it. I think it was Hamer who committed to that project, and because I think in those days even Australia was a little bit provincial in that sense, and the fact that you had our leaders who saw the vision of providing a building like that to house the great collection that they had said a lot about the country, and I think that's continued ever since, and I think the government's been a huge supporter of the NGV.
Yes, because before then it was in the state, up at where the state library was, and it had that sense of being quite musty and dusty, and this was this new, modern, exciting kind of space, that young lovers would go there for a date. I mean, it was fantastic.
Well, I mean, it got a lot of criticism because it was based on a sort of Renaissance palazzo, so it wasn't a truly modernist building. I mean, it was a modern building. In some ways, you could almost argue that it was postmodern, ahead of its time, and in that regard. So, it's a building which I think has sort of really grown into the community's consciousness. I think there's very few people who don't like the NGV building or that whole arts complex, and we do a lot of travel, and there's not many places you go to which have an arts complex like that with a garden setting so close to the city. It's just an absolute pleasure to go to, and really high quality and great content as well.
Here, absolutely. Absolutely right. Tell me about your university studies, Charles, and architect school. I'm really taking you back tonight.
No, I was hopeless. There's a saying that with architecture is that the A students become academics and the B students end up working for the C students. So I think subconsciously I must have known this because I came in as an A student and I worked very hard to become a C student, and I actually failed fourth year, and which was fortuitous because that's when I met Alan Sinman, when I was sort of working part-time to pick up the subjects that I'd failed, and that was the beginning of SJB. So sometimes adversity leads to success.
But what about your wonderful year away working with and that 3 months in Sri Lanka?
Yeah. It was like you do have these sort of unexpected experiences. So when I was working in the firm to earn money, because the year I did architecture, they introduced a year out, and so which was optional. So you could take a year out and to do work experience, or you could continue on and finish in 5 years. So I decided to take the year out, and I worked for 6 months for a firm, and then travelled for 10 months. And I met someone from Sri Lanka who was there, And I told him that I was going to go to India because, you know, there's the Beatles and, you know, India was sort of really part of the consciousness. And I actually did Indian studies as an external subject, which I also failed. But I really enjoyed the content. And so I went, first stop was India. Can you imagine? I landed in Mumbai, and I'd never travelled, you know, although I was 21, but, you know, and I still lived at home. And I thought, oh, I'll just go to Mumbai. So I arrived. I didn't even have a hotel, and I sort of ended up in town, and there were people sleeping on the streets, and it was sort of like a shock to the system. And so the guy from Sri Lanka in the office sort of said, look, you have to go to Sri Lanka, and when you go there, you have to go to Jeffrey Bawa's office and get a job, right? And I didn't know who Jeffrey Bawa was, and it was very early in his career. He wasn't sort of like a sort of a rock star architect when I was there, and that's what I did. I sort of had the chutzpah, and I went there, and I met him, and he interviewed me, and he gave me a job, and he didn't need me. I mean, I think he just sort of, for the fun of it, just gave me a job. And
Because you were brave and you stumbled in.
And I took Leo back there to have a look at the building. And his office was in a townhouse that he designed for a doctor who actually ended up not living there. So I think he bought it and set up his office there. And when I even walked in there for my interview, I was absolutely gobsmacked how beautiful this place was. So it was sort of they had the entry buildings where I think the staff lived and where his Rolls Royce was parked, and then there was this beautiful courtyard with a covered corridor which was open, which had a sort of a pond on either side, and you walk past that into this huge room which had 2 desks on it. And beyond the desk was this garden, right? And he sat on one of the desks. And the other desk was actually his former partner, which was the Danish guy.
Oh, God, I can't remember his name. I can't remember his name.
And then above that was the same size room which had 20 people working in it, which I joined, right? So it was
Old school architect sweatshop.
Yeah, it was a sweatshop.
Hierarchy.
But the good thing is that he let me sort of accompany some of his architects who went around the country inspecting projects. And Bao, he was an amazing architect, and I don't think he's really all that well known internationally currently, but he was a pioneer with regard to resort architecture, and a lot of the resorts that you see in Southeast Asia were sort of based on the precedents that he actually started himself, and this idea of the sort of the large courtyard of which the rooms are built around, and then there's a pool which overlooks the ocean, and you have this transparency with regard to be able to look through the place. And
I mean, he was such a patrician man, and
yeah.
I think he'd studied in Oxford, but he was regarded as kind of not half caste, but you know, he wasn't fully English. He was Sri Lankan. I mean, he was Ceylonese.
Yeah, but he came from a Muslim background.
Yeah, but I think his architecture was a way of saying, I need to own my own identity. I need to own.
He got a law
space
degree
that I
from
live.
Oxford. He came back and decided he didn't want to be a lawyer. He went back to the AA to study architecture, and he came back and he was sort of totally arrogant. I heard stories, for instance, that people would approach him, beg him to design their house, and he'd only do it if they went overseas for 12 months so he could have free reign.
And we did a pilgrimage in Sri Lanka of all the fantastic buildings that he'd done.
We stayed in all his hotels, and I actually...
It's a fantastic thing to do.
Went to see the house that he lived in, and he also had a country place where he actually developed a beautiful garden.
Kandalama.
Had you met at that point when you were doing the internship?
No.
That was long
Yes,
before. So
well-
you returned after having fallen in love with the country. What was your biggest lesson during that internship time? What did he teach you?
Well, I remember, because I grew up in the strictures of modernism, less is more and no decoration and stuff like that. And I went into his home. He bought a terrace house, and he bought the next door terrace house, and he combined them, and they'd been fully renovated in his sort of inimitable style. and there was an opening there in the wall, a masonry wall, and he had these beautifully carved columns there within the opening, sort of appearing to hold it up. And I said to him, "What are they doing there? Are they holding up the wall?" He said, "No." He said, "I was driving past and I found them on the side street and I thought they were so beautiful, I brought them home and put them into the wall." And which was sort of like totally contrary to the sort of philosophy that I was being trained, and what it did do is it sort of just totally relaxed me with regard to not being so sort of fixed in my attitude, and even the way he designed, like, I think he was very instrumental in sort of reintroducing Sri Lankan vernacular into modern architecture there. And he was very much modernist. If you look at his plans, those sort of classic modernism, sort of strong axes and very formal arrangements, but the way that he actually sort of composed the buildings, like for instance, one story had that they wanted to use those sort of Mediterranean tiles, the half round terracotta tiles, and the problem was that because of the monsoons there, they sort of leaked all the time. So he came up with this idea of actually putting corrugated cement sheet first, and putting the tiles on top of the sheets, and then he exposed it underneath. So the corrugated sheets provided the ceiling to the space itself. So it was very innovative with regard to the way that he integrated sort of the traditional Sri Lankan style, which is very much influenced by sort of the Portuguese colonial people that were there beforehand, and the Sinhalese architecture. So that was already a hybrid type of architecture, but then he sort of brought it into modern, and subsequent to me being there, a few years later, he got the commission to design their Parliament House, which was a major public building. But I went down to Gaul one time with one of the architects there, and to meet the site manager, right, who was just looked like one of the peasant guys there with his kaftan on and walking around in bare feet, and what was he doing? He was actually preparing the next day to create the pool. And how was he going to do that? He was going to dynamite a hole in the rock that was actually in the grounds there. And then he hopped onto his tractor. And it also showed you that, you had these people who looked like peasants, but they were super capable. And while I was actually working there, he had a Rolls Royce that he had all these young people stripping back and turning it from a black Rolls Royce into a lemon yellow Rolls Royce, and they're stripping back the paint and redoing the engine and all of that while that was going on. So,
but his vision, Charlie, when we went to Kandalama, the way he'd actually, it's an overgrown jungle kind of space, and how he created something that actually didn't compete with the landscape, but actually it was an insertion into a space perhaps where it shouldn't have been, but he made it work.
Basically, Kandalama was actually built as a frame structure, which actually sat on stilts, as if you could actually get a crane and take that building and shift it. Right, it was sort of so lightly placed in the landscape because it was next to a big sort of reservoir, a man-built reservoir, and behind it was this big rock outcrop. And so it was, from a sort of heritage point of view, an important piece of landscape. And so consequently, the intervention of the building there would have been potentially an obstruction. And so it was really sensitively built as sort of like an international hotel.
We're slowly building up so many incredible travel recommendations on this program. I so often love to hear about the cities and places that were influential in my guest's journey. How long after this trip and then going back for your final year and graduating until you founded SJB?
I graduated in 71 and I joined Alan in 72. I became a partner in 73 and then Michael Bialik joined us, I think in 75. And in 76 we formally formed Sim and Justin Bialik. So next year is the 50th anniversary of the company.
Incredible.
And so...
I'm always interested in how perhaps there was less gatekeeping in the profession back then, where young architects effectively just went for it, and there wasn't this concept of you have to do your time for almost a decade, and really then are you sure?
Well, but it was an emerging... it was a startup.
Yeah.
Right? So Alan started it, and he was well connected and got jobs. And in fact, when I started working with him, I was working in the spare bedroom in their home with him. There was just the two of us, I think. And, and 5 o'clock I had to bathe the kids. And that was part of my work, who are now got their own kids. And and then soon after that, he had an office space in Albert Park, which we moved to. And... we grew very, very quickly. And
what were some of the founding philosophies that were really motivating the practice at the time?
I think the philosophy, we didn't have a signature style as such. Very much committed to finding solutions which were pertaining to the client, the brief, the site. And so it was sort of like an idea to respond. And there are different architects. I mean, there's architects who've got signature styles, and then there's architects like Hurston and Muron, which every building is totally different and there's nothing in common. So that's the way we operated. But also I think we wanted to run a very professional office. And so very early on we introduced systems and made sure, and also we're very conscious about making sure that we're sort of very financially well managed, and we just wanted to have a very fulfilling experience. So we always had nice offices because we probably spent more time in the office than we did at home, and we wanted to have good people, and so very conscious about sort of building a sort of very positive culture within the practice, and also one in which we wanted to empower the people. So we used to actually delegate a lot of tasks to the younger people that came to work for us, and so I think we worked on the principle that someone is smart and comes out of university after 6 years of training, then they've actually got skills and capabilities, and we should tap into that. And it was an idea with regard to how to build a practice which generates the architecture rather than the individuals that generate the architecture.
And I think that rather than the individuals, that sense that you actually, this is from as an outsider looking in, you had as a partnership a complementarity of skill sets. So
I mean, I use the metaphor that a partnership is very much like a marriage. Like the ideally, what you want is you want different skill sets that you bring to the table, and also one in which you need to be cognizant of the other's needs and sort of personalities, and it's not all about you. And so one of the things that we sort of encouraged in our practice is not to use me or I in a conversation. It was always we.
Yes.
Because architecture is such a collaborative exercise, and sometimes you find people who, especially if you've got a larger office, who are wandering around and making contributions who aren't part of the team, and sometimes they can make a suggestion which is actually quite profound and can have quite an influence on the job, and so consequently they never get mentioned as the team that did the job, but they had an influence on the job. So we tended to want to try and downplay that and sort of saw the practice as a totality, and even the people who are non-architects, because I think when you look at organisational structures, you always look at the weakest link. And sometimes some of the support staff, some of the admin stuff, you're as dependent on them to be part of the process to get things done,
Yes.
that they need to perform as well. And you need to credit them with that contribution. The print boy who does the printing or whoever, they have to be done well, prints have to be in order. You don't want to send a tender set and the drawings missing, for instance, which would be a disaster. And so it's that sort of collective responsibility which we found us to be really important, but with that responsibility came opportunity. And so that's the sort of culture we wanted to try.
I'm thinking now of one of the things that you did, which I also think was extraordinary. I haven't thought about it for a long time, how you every year you go away, the three of you, and you would do a think tank. You'd take time out from the practice. And the other thing that I always thought was extraordinary was that you did staff reviews, but you also did reviews about each other.
Yeah.
So that you were subject to the scrutiny of, you're accountable in the same way that your staff were.
Such a strong culture of collaboration, really. That was the foundation of the practice and why it's still going strong and across multiple cities in Australia, 50 years, as you mentioned. That culture of collaboration, as I've had the privilege and pleasure of getting to know you, is as well core to what you do at the Justin Art House Museum. And how both of you are delivering the exhibitions every year and the programs, and when the guests come for the tours, you have the most fabulous dynamic. So I'm so glad you're both in the studio with me, and Leah's been sharing the advice. And the tours are very much like that too, aren't they?
Yeah, well, it's interesting is that, if you discount sort of raising a family and kids and all that, this is the first time that Leah and I have actually worked together on something, which is Jam. And in many ways, Jam is very much a reflection of both of us in terms of our skill sets. So one of the things we're looking for, and what's interesting is that when we started Jam, we were actually travelling blind. We didn't know what we were doing, like house museums, they just...
What inspired the idea?
Well...
And I have to say, this was very much his brainchild. He took me along on his journey.
I get the blame for everything. Yeah.
No, there are a couple of things.
Well, I knew when I was retiring, because one of the things that Alan, Michael, and I decided well before I retired that when as part of this sort of session that Leah talked about, which we went away with regard to the future, and one of the things we discussed is whether we were going to be a one-generational firm or a multi-generational firm. And we decided, without much conversation, that we wanted to be multi-generational because we just could not face the prospect of one day just shutting the doors and all the people who worked for us, who were younger than us, sort of being out of a job, right? And so therefore we thought, well, there are things you need to put in place to make that work, and one of them is succession planning. And and we knew with succession planning is that you got to get the old guys out, and because otherwise, what happens is that the young people don't have space to step up, and so we brought in a mandatory, well, not mandatory, but a retirement at 65. So I knew 15 years ahead the day I was going to retire. And so...
most architects threaten to never retire.
Well, most of them you have to scrape off the drawing board, after they've collapsed at their desk.
Was that a hard decision to make?
No. It was. In fact, I was looking forward to it because I was fortunate to be able to retire at my peak, and I say to people, I say the irony is that the day I retired, I thought to myself, I'm now in a position that I actually have enough knowledge and capability to actually start as an architect, So, and that's when I retired. But and I thought I'd be still young enough to try something else. And so one of the things I ask you is that if I'd stayed on, the amount of energy that I would have had to put in to get from sort of 80% to 90% would have been the same as trying something new and going from 0 to 60%. And
Were you collectors before
yeah,
you retired?
yeah. So that was one of the issues. So what actually precipitated the decision is we had an art collection which was quite significant size-wise. I was retiring. The house we were living in was not suited to the third stage of our life, and we were scratching our heads as to what to do. And then we went to the Lionhouse Museum and had a tour through the house, and we looked at each other and said, this looks like a good idea.
No, we did not look at each other. You looked at me and said, this is a good idea.
Yeah, but you did look back.
I did look back.
And then we actually found a block, a property, which we are now, which is up for sale, which negotiated. We bought it just before I retired, and
we didn't know what to be afraid of. You know, we didn't really know what we were doing, but we didn't know what to be afraid of. And we thought, if nobody comes, if we do set this thing up, so we'll have a great space in which we can enjoy art. So there was no downside, I suppose, in one sense. But I always think, you know, if you're an architect, you'd like to articulate space, something that's intangible. And so that's pretty much what he was doing in some ways, sort of shaping something that was an intangible into something that was kind of concrete.
But I think that one of the successes that we had with SJB and also Plus is we had no fear. We had no fear of failure, because we thought, you know, someone came to us and said, like we had Mab came to us and said, we're going to bid on Docklands. Right, Docklands is a 20-year, multi-billion-dollar project, and we said, okay. We can do that, and because we just saw it as being a sort of an exaggeration of a lot of the other stuff that we'd done, and that's exactly the way it turned out. And
everything's a learning opportunity. I suppose, too,
and it's a learning opportunity. So you know, so we're sitting around the table with 50 different consultants, with half of whom I'd never heard of before, and
like an acoustic.
Well, yeah, but you know, like we had consultants with regard wayfinding consultants, and we had. Sort of a wharf, sort of aging consultant, you know. So we had to get somebody who actually had to put on a frog suit and jump into the water to measure the quality of the piers that are holding up the pier, because there's a building built on top of it. So he did do an estimate that there had to be a sinking fund to replace them in sort of 50 years' time or something. And
that's the remarkable complexity of architecture.
Yeah.
How many different disciplines and themes and topics you have to juggle and wrangle and know at least a little bit about. But now your daughter is a second generation architect then.
Yeah, she is.
And she designed the House Museum.
Yeah. Well, with a lot of interference from her dad.
Was it hard being a sort of a client?
No, in fact, it was a wonderful experience, because I've always argued that the best projects are the ones that come from a collaboration, because what collaboration does, if it's a true collaboration, then it's a sort of meritocracy in the sense that the better ideas come through. And so Lisa and I would discuss issues and would kick things around, and we'd sort of filter out the ideas that we thought were less, and the better ones actually came through. And I've always argued, and I say this to people, is that if you look at books on architecture, architects' own homes are never their best work. And that's because they don't have the checks and balances that you have on a normal project, you know. So I sometimes joke that, you know, all the ideas they couldn't convince their clients to do, they do into their own home, and usually it's a disaster. So, you know, they're never great. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but...
what was the one big idea behind the House Museum home for you?
I think we wanted to create something that embodied the sorts of things we enjoyed when we go to museums. We wanted to engage with it. We think art's about ideas, and we wanted to engage with those sorts of ideas. We wanted to create so there were a couple of things. We wanted to actually try and make contemporary art much more accessible. that it should be in plain speak. You know,
We have that very much in common as well,
exactly,
don't we?
Yeah.
How important is to communicate
yes.
that plainly.
And not to make people feel intimidated when they're coming into a gallery kind of space, and to I think to create some sort of intimacy. I think so. You know, when we've travelled and we've gone into museum spaces, you know, you can often it can be quite isolating. It can be quite lonely. You know, and we wanted to create something that was on a much smaller scale, much more that people were entering into a home as much as they were entering into a museum space. I had at the Jewish Museum had worked with a program that was designed by the Hebrew University, where you actually had you were dealing with biblical texts, but you had lots of different prisms about which you would look at this particular text. So it could be poetry, it could be philosophy, it could be very many different sort of prisms of Judaism in looking at this particular text. And we thought that would be an interesting way to look at art, to use an artwork as a leverage for an idea, but looking at it from many sorts of different perspectives. And I think that was, we wanted to be intellectually stimulated, but we know you have to feed your head. And I always feel if you come into a home, you need to feed people in other sorts of ways. But it was really about creating kind of a almost informal salon, don't you think that, darling?
One of the most amazing parts of the tour is that you actually encourage all your guests and visitors to offer their ideas and their readings of the art and their perception.
Yeah.
And I remember the first question you asked, Charles, is which one makes you the most uncomfortable?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's the Jewish tradition of studying Torah, for instance. You have a group of people who study the text and then they have a discussion and interrogate each other and argue about it. And we thought that would be a good way of doing it with art. So instead of a piece of text, we have a visual text. And it's a similar process, you know. You sort of, someone says something and somebody else will agree or disagree or add to it or provide an alternative, and what it does is it actually generates a discussion, as you saw when you were there. And what I find fascinating is that there are people a lot of the people who come to us are non-art people, and some people come out with some comments which are sort of superbly profound.
But also more than that, you know, darling, they're free to say, I don't like this. I don't necessarily like this. They don't have to pay homage to art just because it's our collection, but they get an understanding of process. They get an understanding of things. So often they'll send us emails afterwards saying, you know, I didn't really necessarily enjoy this particular thing, but it's got me thinking. You know, I haven't stopped thinking about a particular thing, and that's such a great gift for us.
That's such a victory.
Yeah, it's fabulous. Yeah, really fantastic.
And that's very satisfying for us.
Yeah.
And but from an architectural point of view, I think there's a few things that we want to do. For instance, we wanted to design the outside of the building so it was quite legible. So each part had a different architectural expression. So so we're over 3 levels. Each level's got different expressions. So you can tell which is the gallery space, which is the apartment, which is the entry. Internally, we also want to differentiate the space. So the gallery space has got a sort of more traditional gallery feel to it, and the apartment has a genuine domestic feel to it.
Yes, very homely.
Very homely, yeah. I suppose we
integrated art into the
yeah, and we also integrated art. We also wanted the building to have a very high environmental rating. We've got 7+ stars for our particular section. The other thing we also wanted to introduce is we didn't know what was going to happen. Like, we'd never run a house museum, so we wanted to actually introduce quite a bit of flexibility inbuilt into it to give us the options for change. So we've got sliding doors which you can close off places. We've got coaxial cable running through the whole building so we can hook up things if we want to at a later date. All the lighting's flexible. And also the spaces are multi-purpose. So our garage actually acts as a sort of small auditorium, and we have concerts in our gallery. The acoustics are really well. We have visitors coming up to our apartment, and so we wanted to have space there that they could actually move. And so sometimes we talk about that we sort of designed it like a piano accordion that can sort of expand and contract according to its needs. and also that it can actually fulfil several functions at different times quite effectively.
You do these big annual exhibitions. Your current show that's on is Minimal.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the conceptual framework behind that show? And because you've always collected contemporary and abstract art from emerging artists, how did you design or come up with Minimal?
Well, because we collect a lot of abstract art, we wanted to... originally, we were going to do an exhibition called The Language of Abstraction. But when we started sort of blocking it out, it was just too big. And because abstraction is really diverse, and our collection has got nearly every example of different facets of abstract representation, and so we thought that would actually fit better in a public museum than ours. So we looked at actually sort of compressing it into something a bit more manageable. And so we came up with the idea of minimal, and it was called minimal rather than minimalism, because minimalism is actually a subset of abstraction. So minimal actually covers both abstraction and minimalism, and in some ways it's sort of connected to architecture, because one of the things we want to do with JAM is we want to look at that intersection between art and architecture. So I talk about the sort of experience I had as an architect actually growing up and training within the realm of modernism. And so we came to a realisation that actually one of the characteristics of modernism, which sort of, I suppose, is dated from the 1860s to about the 1960s, is this whole idea of reductionism, which applied to everything in terms of the creative field. So it applied to architecture, it applied to visual arts, to music, to literature, to drama, to opera, and so on and so forth. Different forms of reductionism, but and in many ways it was sort of like almost a desire of modernism to sort of create a new world which was distinct from the previous world. And you know, we grew up in the 60s, you know, so I mean the 60s was a huge era of turmoil, you know. I mean, you had gay rights, you had feminism, you had
Huge change.
yeah, civil rights, you know, and a lot of those issues still aren't resolved, and in fact they've expanded into other areas as well. And so the sort of very traditional conservative old world was one that actually modernism wanted to move beyond, and so we thought that as a sort of foundation narrative for the exhibition, it was sort of a really strong idea, and so we wanted to use our art to, I suppose, illustrate that narrative, and then to talk about it as part of the tours and also as part of our public programs.
It's a fabulous journey, and listeners can just book in on your website for a tour and a visit, and also see the additional exhibition that's upstairs in your apartment too.
Yeah. So we've got 2 exhibitions, first time ever, both independently curated, showing 2 different perspectives from 2 different collections about the similar topics. So yeah, you get your money's worth, 2 for the price of 1.
It's a fabulous day. Everyone should absolutely go. We've just had a text message come in. Hi, Charles and Leah. How do you decide which artists or works you add to your collection? Do you both always agree on acquisitions, or are they lively debates? And that one's come from an anonymous texter.
Shall I tell you about the first work we ever bought?
Oh, please do.
Charles was still a practice. We got married very young, and he was still at university, and he was asked by a colleague or friend to design his first home. And when it came to the matter of payment, that's kind of tricky because he wasn't fully qualified as an architect. He said, "Why don't you go and buy an artwork?" We were shocked.
Now, the reality is I was happy to do it for free.
Yes, but this was kind of this bonus thing. So we wandered off to a gallery, which is where it no longer exists, on the corner of Toorak Road and Chapel Street. So it was a very established kind of gallery. I think James Mollison was the director at that stage there. And we both wandered around, as we do in galleries. We end up wandering, not hand in hand, but we wander. And we both came and said, "You've got to look at this work. You've got to look at this work." And it was the same work we both had fallen in love with. It sits in my study now. That's nearly the last time that that happened. No, it's actually not. But I have to say, and it's not a criticism, you really are the driver of the collection. And I don't know anymore, in answer to your the question, I don't know anymore when I go into a gallery whether I'm actually seeing something and responding to it because I actually love it, or whether how much has my taste been shaped. When you live with somebody for over 50 years, how much has my taste been shaped or reshaped because of Charles's very strong taste? But there are many things that he buys that I find very difficult to understand and causes us interesting conversations.
And these conversations come out during the tour too, which is why it's really so enjoyable.
Yeah. But there's works that I bought which she's very much warm to, and so it cuts both ways.
Do you have a work in your collection you find yourself constantly returning to or wanting to re-show or have close by that you don't put it away into storage?
Well, there's a few works that we have on permanently up in our home, which are sort of seminal works in our collection. But look, we've got about 400 works in our collection, and we've never sold one because we see our collection as a sort of like an archaeology of our life. And so each acquisition represents a moment in time of who we were at that time and why we actually acquired that work. And so we could almost track our life, or our married life, through the collection. But of those, there's some works which have lasted the test of time that are sort of favourites of ours that we could sort of look at forever, and
some that our children will fight over.
Yeah,
no
people
doubt.
fight over. So, but nonetheless, I think the way we operate, we actually only show probably 60 works at any one time. So the works get rotated, and then they get freshened up with new acquisitions. And what's interesting is that, as familiar you are with works, when they come out of the storage and you see them again, you actually see them with a fresh eye, and you start seeing things you hadn't seen before. And that's why we strongly recommend to collectors to not to put this salon hang in their home, but to have a space where they can store works. And we've got a close friend who's also got a terrific collection, not as big as ours. And what they do is they re-hang it every once in a while. And they said even shifting it from the hallway into the lounge room is a huge difference because the light is different, its spatial environment is different, and again they see the work from a different perspective and a different level of appreciation, and that's a really good idea to do that as well. So and it's funny because sometimes we have people who've been to us before and they come again and they said, "Oh, you've done a renovation," and we said, "No, we just rehung the artwork," and that's what it does. It's sort of it just changed the whole concept of how you relate to the space, depending on the works that are there. And so from that point of view, we're pleased about that, because in our previous home, we sort of hung as many items on the wall that we could, and it was too crowded, and you never really appreciated the work for what they were. And so that's worked really well. We're pretty happy about that.
What did you learn in running and curating the museum that a career in architecture and like working together, you also work together at SJB, that being an architectural practice didn't teach you?
Oh, what a great question.
Let me think. I think the narrative is different. All right, so which is not to say, like we were a commercial practice, and so and not all architects operate like that. There's some architects who are very good at actually attaching a philosophical narrative to their work. So the work actually becomes a representation of a sort of philosophical idea that they want to promote. We didn't do that. I was talking to developers. They're not interested in that. They just want to know how much money they're going to make out of it. And I have to actually explain to them why we designed it in such a way that this will actually optimise their potential in terms of, how popular it will be, how well it will function, how economical it will be to build, how efficient it'll be, all those sorts of things. So they weren't really interested in sort of a narrative. But with the exhibitions that we put on, what we have to think about is the story we're going to tell, and how do the works fit together in telling that story, and what's that story meant to be saying. So, what is the idea that we're trying to explore? Now, look, a lot of curated exhibitions don't go that far, but for us it's very important to do that. So, and it's interesting, we had Vince Alisi, who came to a tour. He now is the director of Linden Art Gallery, and he made an observation. He said, you guys aren't talking about the art, using the art to talk about the idea. It was sort of like a reversal. And
that's a very architectural approach for me, because I keep hammering on this program that architecture is about ideas.
Yeah.
So it's a very natural lens through which to view it.
Yeah, and it is about ideas. But the interesting thing is that, it's like last year's exhibition, is that the sort of functional aspect of, or utilitarian nature of architecture is a sort of quite a dominant feature of architecture. Like, it has to work.
Yeah.
Right? And whereas artwork doesn't have to work. Artwork can just be part of the story, right? And it works in a certain sense in that regard. And so we have. So one of the things I find really intriguing in having this conjunction between art and architecture is, when does architecture become art? Right? Or when does anything become art? And and constantly you hear people, I always want to be an architect, but I'm not creative. And I'm still saying, no, everybody's creative. Everybody's creative. You're just creative in different ways, and you shouldn't be beating yourself up about that. I find Leah, as much as she protested that she's not creative, she is super creative in so many different ways. It's just a different form of creativity.
Yes.
And,
See why our marriage has lasted so long?
I can. There's so many good lessons here, not just for career advice, but for life too.
And so consequently, I think that creativity takes so many different forms with so many different objectives.
But it's interesting when I think about architecture. When people come to you as an architect, they've come with a specific brief. When people come to us, it's the unexpected. They don't know what they're going to be getting, and they always, pretty much always, walk away saying, "I've thought about things I've never thought about before." Now, that's not something we would have known would have happened when we were setting up JAM. We had a very specific intent, but we had no idea of the outcome. When you're an architect, you've got a brief and you know what the outcome is going to be. And I think that, for me, is a quite interesting difference.
That's the magic of art, though, that journey and that opportunity for discovery.
But it's interesting, because of my architectural background, part of our public programs is we're committed to having 2 talks a year by architects, and we've had some top architects speaking at JAM, and the brief to them is that what we want to explore is the intersection between art and architecture, about those 2 creative acts which are really quite different, and how do they actually come together, and how do they intersect, and how does one influence the other? And we've had some fantastic talks, and many of them are actually posted on our website because they're videoed. And
what's the website address and the Instagram handle for listeners? How can they get in touch and book in with you?
Well, it's just jam.com.au, and our email is info@jam.com.au. It's very simple.
Get in touch, listeners. Book in. Go for a tour. Must-see show, and it's a museum you can keep coming back to. We won't spoil it too much. Indeed, you don't know what you're going to discover there. I certainly didn't in my first visit. I knew a few of the works I might see, but it was just full of whimsy and wonder and discovery. I'm mindful of the time, so I will ask my last question, and that's, what gives you hope?
I've always said, why the Jewish people have survived so long? Because they live in hope, right? That's one of the characteristics. They live in hope. The problem with hope, it always leads to disappointment. And that's why in Yiddish, there must be 1,000 words for disappointment. And look, I believe in hope But I think hope is a empty aspiration. I think human beings have got agency to do things. So don't sit there and hope. Sit there about saying, I'm going to do something about this, right? And start doing something about it. And I think that, if every human being took that attitude to sort of, what can I do that's positive, then you don't need to have hope.
I can't top that. That's fabulous. You give me hope this relationship's going to last.
Thank you so much for joining me on the program, Charles and Leah.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Just another day, I was talking with my dad. He's off to see the dentist for a toothache going bad. DVA, they pay his bills cause he went to Vietnam. Still they've taken more from him than he'll ever take from them. Grateful that he loves me, grateful that he cares. And even when there's nothing else, I'm grateful that he's there.
Hi, this is James Ellis, and you're listening to Radio Karim. Keep supporting local community radio.
Just another day, I was talking with my mom. They're cutting down